I'm going to spend more time than usual talking about the reading today, unpacking it, to continue James's metaphor of baggage from last Sunday. There's a lot in this reading, and so I'm going to invite you to hear it 2 more times before the service is over, once in just a moment, and once more at the end of the sermon. In this way, it will be a little like the spiritual practice of Lectio Divina. In Lectio Divina, a reading is read 3 times in 3 different voices. In the first pass, you listen for a word or phrase that catches your attention. I wonder if you think about it now, was there a word or phrase that caught your attention in the reading? Maybe one of the questions the author, Frederick Buechner, asks, or the phrase, filled our emptiness. Maybe it was the part at the end where he says we will know whom to thank, and it sounds suspiciously like he's talking about an old-fashioned paternal type God. In fact, he just said him a few sentences before. Cringe. Or maybe you were distracted and you didn't hear very much of the reading. That happens to me all the time when I'm a listener. We all get monkey minds, and our thoughts swing from one place to another, and we miss what is happening right in front of us. In Lectio Divina, in the second reading, you listen for what wisdom, if any, is speaking through the text. Is there some spiritual truth in it? Here's our second read-through. We must, each one of us, remember our own lives. Someone died whom we loved and needed, and from somewhere something came to fill our emptiness and mend us where we were broken. Was it only time that mended, only the resurging busyness of life that filled our emptiness? In anger, we said something once that we could have bitten our tongues out for afterwards, or in anger, somebody said something to us. But out of somewhere, forgiveness came, a bridge was rebuilt, or maybe forgiveness never came, and to this day we have found no bridge back. Is the human heart the only source of its own healing? Is it the human conscience only that whispers to us that in bitterness and estrangement is death? We listen to the evening news with its usual recital of shabbiness and horror, and God, if we believe in him at all, seems remote and powerless. A child's dream. But there are other times, often the most unexpected, unlikely times, when strong as life itself comes the sense that there is a holiness deeper than shabbiness and horror, and at the very heart of darkness, a light unutterable. Is it only the unpredictable fluctuations of the human spirit that we have to thank? We must, each of us, answer for ourselves, remember for ourselves, preach to ourselves our own sermons. But remember the wonderful works, sings King David in the Psalms, because if we remember deeply and truly, he says, we will know whom to thank, and in that room of thanksgiving and remembering, there is peace. There ends the reading. Frederick Buechner is a writer and a theologian. He's had a great influence on one of my teachers in ministry, and so in that way, also on me. He's ordained as a Presbyterian minister, and this reading is a response to one of the sacred scriptures from his tradition, the Psalms, in which King David speaks of an experience to which some of us can relate, a time he felt lowly and miserable, and something happened, and he was saved from despair. The cords of death entangled me, the psalmist writes in King David's voice. The anguish of the grave came over me. I was overcome by distress and sorrow. When he finds himself looking back on this rock-bottom sorrow from a better place, and he wonders how he ever got through it, he gives thanks to God. But Buechner has an expansive theology that resonates beyond merely Christian circles. He's prone to saying things like, God, if we believe in him, which raises the question of whether Buechner himself believes in God or whether he believes in God all the time. People who are emphatic and certain about the existence of God tend to find his writings annoyingly blurry on the issue. What is clear is that he finds a lot of meaning in stories about God and in the idea that people seem to have such a profound need to tell those kinds of stories. We can't prove God exists, and even those of us who've had mystical experiences or a feeling of closeness with something we might call by that name know how fickle those experiences or that relationship can be at times. We may feel filled up and swept along by some spirit greater than ourselves some days or some years, and then experience many more years after that in which God is no wind sweeping us along, but is more like still air, invisible, imperceptible, or we fear, absent. But whether we've had any sort of divine experience at all, or whether we consider ourselves atheists, there's some aspect of human existence that suggests relationality, relationship with something more than ourselves. And God is certainly not the only way to understand that. I'll say more about what I mean by that relationality in a minute. As an aside, Christine delivered a truly lovely science-oriented sermon a few weeks ago about what kind of God might exist, how we could understand that in today's world in light of science. And if you missed it and you're wondering about that, I would suggest going to the church website where you can see it on the Sermon Archives page. This is not a sermon about whether or not God exists, but it's about where that nudging, where that human experience of relationality intersects with the spiritual practice of gratitude. This is what Buechner gets at in his response to King David's psalm. He starts by telling us that gratitude is a matter of remembering our own lives. What does he mean by remember our own lives? How could we forget them? We're in them all the time. Remember is a word with nuanced meanings. One meaning is to assert the importance of something, as in, remember that this is a secret, or remember that this teaching can transform our lives. Right? To tell someone to remember something is to emphasize it. Remember your life. It is sacred. It is important. Our lives are the only thing we are guaranteed, and even then we can only count on this moment and the ones behind us. The future is uncertain, so remember. And to remember is to bring our awareness to something, whether it's important or not. To remember is to bring something to mind and to bring your mind to it. Consciousness, awareness. To remember is to pay attention. To really remember something is to make ourselves present to it again, even though it may have happened in the past. It is to make it present again in our minds. We each must remember our lives, Buechner says. When we remember our lives in this way, what do we see? What do we know? What do we recognize all over again? Buechner lifts up those moments when, like David in the psalm, we may have experienced healing or wisdom of some kind. And how does that come about? Through time, through patience and hard work, through some lesson that develops or arises in us that maybe we truly did not know until the moment it struck us. How did that happen? I remember the words of the staunch atheist Christopher Hitchens, an extremely effective writer and debater who once said that sometimes he would utter a sentence or word that he did not know he had in him until that moment. And when this happened, he said, he had the feeling that it was, quote, not all done by hand. Now, he was not referring to God. That idea was repulsive to him. But clearly, he experienced something awe-inspiring in the creative process. Likewise, when our relationships are broken and then we find the courage and receive the grace to mend them, Buechner asks, was it only our hearts and conscience whispering to us? Where did the love come from? I say received the grace because I think of grace as a gift we cannot earn. When something happens that is beautiful and we didn't have the power to force it to happen, I call that grace. When a loved one forgives us, that is grace. In some cases, when we forgive a loved one, that is also grace for us, because forgiveness does not always come to us easily. Sometimes we wish and wish we could forgive someone, and in the end, when it happens, we may feel like Hitchens, that it was not all done by hand. Was it only time? Asks Buechner. Is the human heart the only source and the conscience the only thing whispering to us? Do we have only randomness to thank? Or isn't there a holiness deeper than shabbiness and horror? Holiness isn't a magical concept. To say something is holy is to say that it is worthy of our great respect, reverence, and awe. Isn't there something still holy this week, even beneath the horror and shabbiness of the news? What news? And yet there is also singing. And isn't there at the very heart of darkness a light unutterable, something we can't name? The will to life, the grace of healing, the love that surrounds us, each of us, and carries us when we do not realize we are being carried. Like the Ojibwe song of the bird I mentioned a few weeks ago, where it is said, "Sometimes I go about in pity for myself, and all the while the wind is bearing me across the sky." Buechner knows we don't all experience this mystery the same way, and that is why he says we must answer for ourselves and remember for ourselves and preach our own sermons. He is a preacher. I'm a preacher. But we both know that in the end, you have to preach your own sermon to yourself, in the same way that ministers often preach the sermons they themselves need to hear. Trade secret. Universally true. When I'm up here, it's not a matter of information just flowing from me to you. I'm in this journey with you, discovering with you. I'm just doing it in public. I've made a vocation of it. You've asked me to pay extra close attention to life and to the wisdom of the ages and to share as I learn. But we're all in the journey together. In this journey, we're only part of the picture. There are forces beyond us of love and wisdom and creativity that we somehow connect with from time to time, and they transform us. To practice spiritual gratitude, spiritual thanksgiving for that unutterable light, for that part of our life worthy of our great respect, reverence, and awe, is to notice what is bearing us across the sky. If we remember deeply and truly, the reading says, we will know whom to thank, and in that room of thanksgiving and remembering, there is peace. Buechner is giving these words to King David. He knows the whom is troublesome. It's a stand-in. Some people will know the mystery as a you or a whom, and they'll brush aside the problem of trying to name what is unutterable. Others will cringe at the clumsy attempt to utter it. But when you get down to it, knowing whom or what to thank is less about articulating your theology and more about just deeply understanding what you yourself are. This critter, this being. Interacting with mystery, co-creating with it, living in it. That is what we are grateful for mystery, creativity, and life. That is what we are in relationship with. Well, that is all very deep and very true, I hope. I hope at least some of it resonates with you. But what about our regular old everyday lives? The part where we aren't blown over by awe. What then does spiritual thanksgiving look like? The two parts are connected, the sacred and the mundane. Gratitude is a spiritual practice that connects them. The authors Frederick and Marianne Broussat writes, "The spiritual practice of gratitude has been called a state of mind and a way of life, but we prefer to think of it as a grammar, an underlying structure that helps us construct and make sense out of our lives. Its syntax reveals a system of relationships linking us to the divine and to every other part of creation." To learn the grammar of gratitude, they say, practice saying thank you for happy and challenging experiences, for people, animals, things, art, memories, dreams. Utter blessings and express your appreciation to everything and everyone you encounter. By blessing, we are blessed. I love the idea that the act of randomly blessing others in our hearts is an expression of gratitude. And it's not just a nice thought to say that through the spiritual practice of gratitude, we will be blessed. Studies have shown that people with regular practices of giving thanks really do experience increased well-being and better health. They even exercise more, and they feel that life is better, and they are optimistic. In contrast, people who are in the habit of focusing on the negative, on what's not going well in their lives, end up feeling less happy, and that impacts their choices, which in turn can lead to a negative cycle. Someone also once called playing an expression of gratitude. Playing. Have you played lately? With a friend or a pet or a child? I've got a couple of teenage kids, and every once in a while, I just like to wrestle one of them to the ground. Just kind of out of the blue. I just take them out. And I'm inevitably grateful afterward. Not only that I survived it, but for the joy of making them crack up at their absurd mother. The Broussard suggests some ways to build a practice of gratitude into our lives by devising little cues to remind ourselves. Picking up a spoon to eat a meal is a cue to practice gratitude. Every time I walk into the door of my home, I am reminded to count my blessings. On your birthday, you can vow to practice gratitude during the new year. Another way is to build it in throughout your day, to pray thank you when you wake up. You don't have to pray to anyone. You can just wake up thinking thank you instead of ugh, the alarm, right? You can wake up thinking thank you. Make your coffee thinking thank you. Take a warm shower thinking thank you. And then express thanks to others at some part in the middle of your day. Have you offered a really heartfelt thank you to someone lately? And remember what you are thankful for at the end of your day. Review the day in your mind. Lift up the lovely bits, big or small, the blessings. Give thanks for those. Now, let's talk about resistance. The I'm grateful, buts. You ever do that? I'm grateful for all that I have, but I want, need, deserve more. I'm grateful for the love of friends and family, but they are being impossible. I'm grateful for the food that nourishes my body, but I've got to get rid of these thighs. My grandmother used to say that when I was growing up. I've got to get rid of these thighs. She was beautiful, by the way, with her Georgia peach skin, blonde hair, and curves like the Road to Sandia crest. She had birthed 4 children, and she was strong. But like many of us, she had absorbed the negative messaging of our culture around women's bodies. I've always had it in mind to write a sermon called Mostly Grateful, Slightly Mad, which might be the best we can do a lot of the time. You know, if you came to church today with something really painful going on in your life, you may not feel like you're in a place right now to give thanks. The idea that practicing gratitude could help you might seem trite or cliche. Did King David give thanks as the cords of death entangled him? Or didn't he just pray for mercy and revenge? And yet, spiritual thanksgiving is not about denying our painful experiences or feelings. It's not about putting on a happy face or rose-colored glasses. It is about remembering our lives, bringing them to mind, bringing our minds to them in their fullness, not getting swept away by one feeling or one experience, because those things do not define us. We are more than those things. As a wise person once said, when we see the hole but not the donut, we really miss the point. We can feel grief and gratitude at the same time. jealousy and gratitude. Anger and gratitude are harder to pair, but you can. When we give thanks at the end of the day, that is the time, though, to set resentments aside. Maybe we can change those buts to ands. I'm grateful for what I have, and I'm mindful for when it feels like not enough and why. I'm grateful for my family, and things are really painful between me and some of my family members, and I don't know how to fix it. I'm grateful for my body, which has carried me so far in my life, and I'm struggling with self-loathing or illness or addiction or. By the way, the same lesson applies to the national holiday of Thanksgiving. We can participate in the cultural celebration without putting on rose-colored glasses or denying the way this holiday has been used to put a positive spin on a violent colonization of land. We can have the spiritual and emotional maturity to say, I won't look the other way anymore, and still celebrate the feast day. Doing so takes Thanksgiving to a whole new level. Imagine if our whole country did that. And as part of giving thanks, we blessed our neighbors in our hearts. I've asked Paul Brown from the choir to help me with the final reading of Frederick Buechner's words today because different voices bring out different nuances in a reading and invites us to hear it with new ears. In the first pass, maybe there was a word or phrase that stood out. In the second pass, you listened for what wisdom, if any, was in the text. In the third pass, you listen for what you are called to be or do through the wisdom of the text. What are you called to be or do through this text?
I speak again the words of Frederick Buechner. We must, each one of us, remember our own lives. Someone died who we loved and needed, and from somewhere, something came to fill our emptiness and mend us where we were broken. Was it only time that mended? Only the resurging busyness of life that filled our emptiness? In anger, we said something once that we could have bitten our tongues off afterwards. Or in anger, somebody said something to us. But out of somewhere, forgiveness came. A bridge was rebuilt. Or maybe no forgiveness came. And to this day, we have found no bridge to walk back. Is the human heart the only source of its own healing? Is the human conscience the only that whispers to us that in bitterness and estrangement is death? We listen to the evening news with its usual recital of shabbiness and horror. And God, if we believe in him, seems remote and powerless, a child's dream. But there are other times, often the most unexpected, unlikely times, when, strong as life itself, comes the sense that there is a holiness deeper than shabbiness and horror. And at the very heart of darkness, a light unutterable. Is it only the unpredictable fluctuations of the human spirit that we have to thank? We must each answer for ourselves, remember for ourselves, preach to ourselves our own sermons. But remember the wonderful works, sings King David, because if we remember deeply and truly, he says, we will know whom to thank. And in that room of thanksgiving and remembering is peace.
Please rise in body or in spirit for our closing hymn, number 53, I Walk the Unfrequented Road.